Good afternoon. Thank you so much for attending this session over lunch. Hopefully you got a moment to grab some lunch. And thank you for taking time from your precious schedules to participate in reInvent. You're probably sitting here wondering, how can I grow my business on AWS? Well, the good news is, hopefully this session will provide you some observations and some of our thoughts. My name is Sabina Joseph, and I'm responsible for both storage technology and consulting partners globally. Partners have benefited and customers have benefited by rethinking, rescaling, and remessaging their business on AWS. In this session, we would like to share with you some lessons learned through the stories of Commvault and Druva, our partners, and their customers. With data doubling every 2 years, there's no better time than now for you. Data protection market is growing at a rate of 3.4% on premises, but in the cloud it is growing at a rate of 26%. Information archiving will almost double to $7 billion next year, and disaster recovery as a services is growing at a rate of 53% and will achieve about $12 billion in 2 years. All of this creates tremendous stickiness for your business and an opportunity to provide incremental value. Well, all of you probably have heard of the APN competency program. Hopefully you had a chance to join the keynote this morning, where we highlight key technology and consulting partners who have achieved breadth and depth of solutions, customer references, and also a demonstrated commitment to growing their business on AWS. The APN Storage Competency Program was launched in 2015 with technology partners, and in June of this year we launched it with consulting partners. And this highlights some of our key partners in this competency. Customers can confidently select solutions from primary storage, backup recovery, archiving, and BCDR. Well, you're probably wondering, why should I do this? Well, one of the interesting tidbits of information that I found out, and I think Terry shared it this morning in his keynote, is partners who are part of the competency program have actually grown their revenue 100% year over year in 2017, which is more than 2x the revenue of non-competency partners. So how can we help you succeed and grow your business? How do your existing solutions align with what customers are looking for? Many of your solutions are built for on-premises workloads, and in some cases when we start to work with our partners, we observe that your solutions might interact differently with our services. Example, EBS versus on-premises SAN. But what we do is we work with you. Instead of lifting and shifting your solutions, we work with you to redesign and achieve the same results with our services. Helicap Customer Advisory Board. By talking to our customers together, we can understand the challenges they're facing as they execute their cloud-first strategy. Unlocking customer value, isn't that what it's all about? And by talking to them, we can find that incremental value add for these customers. I know many of you have 1,000 things coming at you at a very fast pace as you develop your cloud roadmap and your solutions. What we have observed is if you spread yourselves too thin, the solution may be less robust, and you might end up being all things to everyone. Hence, what we recommend is diving deep and customizing your solution across the breadth and depth of our services. I know we launch a lot of services on a yearly basis, Please stay close to your alliance manager and your SA. We are here to help you, both in terms of beta opportunities and also post-launch as to what are some of the things that you can leverage. When we work with our partners, we tend to look at three steps. Build the foundation, take your existing solutions and integrate it into our services. This will enable both existing customers and new customers to quickly start leveraging your solutions on AWS. Rethink and re-architect and customize your solution to leverage the breadth and depth of our services. And finally, extend the value chain. Let's work together to unlock the value of dark data for customers. Across all of these three steps is one thing, which is the business model. Rethinking, rescaling, and remessaging the business model is critical to achieve mutual success. Well, AWS model is built for high volume, low margin, scaling to millions of customers in a pay-as-you-go model. Let's work together. If maybe there's a tweak needed in the business model, let's work together. And most importantly, let's work together in parallel to developing the solution. I know business models are tough to adapt, but I think that if we work together to understand what needs tweaked and also the lessons that we have learned from other partners, it will be critical. We also want to give customers all the options, cover all the bases. Hence, we suggest considering marketplace, direct, and channel. By understanding the licensing options the customers are leveraging with all three, it will enable us to provide these options to the customers. I know that sales culture and sales incentives are daunting to adapt. However, we believe that we need to be firm together so we can align better in the field. Maybe it is a tweak through MBOs, maybe it's a new sales incentive structure, maybe it's cloud overlay sales teams and engineers, maybe it's retraining existing sales teams and engineers. So this way, when we are in front of the customer together, we're talking the same language. We also want to reduce friction for customers when they are pricing, negotiating, and buying a solution. A lot of our services are ephemeral. They come and go, and it's a pay-as-you-go model. Is your licensing model a constant chargeback to the customer? If it so happens that maybe your licensing model is an annual fee versus pay-as-you-go, together we may not look aligned in front of the customer. I'm sure you are aware that many of our deals has a large presence of consulting partners. By working with your alliance manager, maybe we can identify the consulting partners that are ideal for your business globally. Technology and consulting partners can provide tremendous value-add services, things like hybrid architecture, storage design services, assessment services, compliance policy-based services, and even create new as-a-service models such as backup and recovery as a service, disaster recovery as a service. And together, if we all three of us align, maybe we can enable storage to be viewed as a tax the same way customers are allocating their budget today. Well, how has your messaging evolved to what customers are already used to? As you may be aware, customers are either already using our services or they have a cloud-first mandate, and they're looking for clear solution-specific messaging. Customers are also looking for crisp self-service actions that they might already be doing, such as quick starts, marketplace, and so on. I'm sure that you agree that when we write a case study together, we want to present that joint story of the value of your solution on top of our services, plus also the deep technical integration. By introducing the AWS visual imagery and nomenclature, It will enable the customer to quickly visualize. So let's take a reference architecture of your solution. If we take that reference architecture and introduce the AWS service icons, the customer can quickly see how data is flowing on premises into AWS or within AWS through your solution. By aligning on messaging and delivery model, it makes it seamless for the customer. And finally, one other best practice that I do want to share with you is a dedicated microsite, similar to an AWS service page. A number of you have probably done it. I know commvault.com/AWS, druva.com/AWS. It's basically a one-stop shop for any stakeholder, whether that is your partner community, AWS, customers who come there to learn about your solution, your value add, demos, technical white papers, reference architectures, links to consulting partners globally, and also links to AWS Marketplace so they can quickly start to try and buy your solution. And also, if we work together to align the same messaging and have the technology partner and the consulting partner microsite linked into the APN storage competency, no matter where the customer goes, they see the same message of your solution and your value proposition on top of AWS. Well, I'd like to, at this point in time, introduce Brian Brockway, CTO of Commvault. Brian and their team exemplifies rethinking, rescaling, and remessaging their business on AWS. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabina. Here we go. So thanks for your time today. And as Sabina started positioning inside there, what we wanted to do is share a bunch of our insights, experiences, and really kind of how it has this partnership, the integration, and kind of this whole rethink transformed itself into a whole bunch of nice, terrific value cases for customers that are really starting to disrupt what they were doing in the data center as they're all trying to really figure out the move to cloud. That is no longer just an interesting idea. We're now seeing a pretty tremendous adoption rate and a shift coming in through there. And a lot of this comes back down to your partnership with AWS. So first off, kind of starting the story inside here. So Commvault, and for those that don't know us, we're a leader inside the enterprise data management space. We've been a data protection vendor inside the enterprise for many years. We started our transition into the cloud space actually about 4 or 5 years ago. So we started like many others, let's start off with the storage integration. Inside the environment, can we start to take some of those data sets and move them off into the cloud, start as alternative targets? I will say back then, there are a lot of people looking at the cloud and saying, this sounds like it's going to be an SMB type story. It's going to be very channel focused. It's going to be thousands of customers with little workloads all trying to connect themselves in the cloud. And I'll tell you, we've actually had the reverse experience. We found in many of the larger enterprises, they're really the first group that is coming in with really large scale problems. They're looking at the clouds now as alternative to their data center buildouts. And a lot of our CIO conversations in many cases are, they would very much like to get themselves out of buying storage and servers. I'd much rather get into a rental and an elastic usage model inside many of these environments. The big challenge becomes, how do I start to integrate my data, transition, shift, and move it over into the cloud environments, keep it all part of a nice SLA type model and with compliance wrapped around there, and then make sure that it's relatively easy for the end users. So where a lot of this starts off with is back to your integration points. As I pointed out earlier, a lot of this started with us on the storage side. So I have a nice little integration map over here. Back on my left-hand side is where a lot of the different workloads we protect. Everything from virtual machines to desktops to large applications and even more increasingly down into a lot of the bigger data environments. These get protected on site naturally, over encrypt, dedupe, and go off and put it into the cloud-based storage, into the S3, into the IaaS, or even into the Glacier environments, which is a fantastic fit in many of these use cases. especially when we start to see large organizations back in the enterprise that are still having to comply with very deep retention needs, many that have to exist for many years and many generations of storage. Coming into the cloud is a fantastic alternative fit. The next piece of the puzzle, though, is not just getting your data into the cloud, is how do I make it usable again? And this is where a lot of the integration has come back into play with things like the EBS, the conversions, coming in and starting to use cloud like a programmatic environment, where what we can do is we can go off and we can call up new workloads, come back in, tie the data back together to put it back into a useful asset for the organization. More importantly, even do some things like transformation. So when life is still running in VMware, back in your production environment, and you're starting to protect those data assets, can I bring it over into the cloud and can I automatically transform it back into AMI and EC2 instances? Why? Because in a lot of cases, we have customers that are starting to look, can I start to break my dependency chain of I'm a VMware on one side and I'd like to be able to start to use different hypervisors for different purposes on the other side of my relationship. So we do a lot of that automatic transformation. You come over and this is perfect fit for things like your dev test and your DR type use cases, a variety of others that we're seeing customers adopt into. But then the next piece of the puzzle becomes is once that data is now live in the cloud, your responsibility shifts from on-prem back into the cloud to ensure I can extend the same level of protection. And this is where it comes back into your integration points of, can I protect the data efficiently inside the cloud? Ensure that I have tag verification and all of my tags are moving from snaps to replication points across availability zones. And at the end of the day, can I keep this all relatively seamless and easy for my end users? So what this becomes very much a partnering engagement with your AWS engineering teams. As Sabina said, a lot of those new services that are developing out every quarter becomes another piece of the puzzle, come back in and wrap into your strategy. We've kept a very proactive engagement cycle with them. It's great from our perspective because we would rather not move the data if I don't have to. I would much rather say, can I ensure that the integrity of the data set? Can I drive much more of the SLA context on top? And how do I make it easy and useful for my end users? Second piece, as Sabina also pointed out, is how do you start to change your business model? So as she pointed out earlier, there's a lot of people that have developed inside the cloud environments. We're one that developed inside legacy. So we developed out of the data centers. We spent many years on things like perpetual licensing models and others. We have a very large channel business at Commvault. About 90% of our business is actually executed through channel partners and relationships inside there. Doing the transformation to go back in and start to convert ourselves on not only the language, but a lot of our licensing models and others to make ourselves a much more conducive fit for cloud was a big challenge. Took us a couple of years, but we've actually got it all working very nicely now. This is what we're really starting to see is a lot of our ramp adoption rates. So back into my user model that we just talked about before, today we're usually seeing about 250% growth rate in terms of the amount of data we're seeing move off of on-prem environments and off into cloud-based solutions to go off and power a lot of these new DR, dev tests, and other type use cases out there. What's nice about this is it's not just coming in and starting to use some of the technology, but it's how do we interweave this technology back into a value proposition? So turning it back into things like how do I reduce cost? How do I reduce risk? How do I start to turn it into a much more extensive way to come in and increase and improve the business back for the user? Final piece is coming back into those use cases, and this is, I think, the challenge every one of us has inside the room here, is it's not just talking technology to end users. It's how do I take all that integration points, how do I put it together around a use case that's identifiable to the business and they can recognize, and it's associated with the business problem. This is where we start to see a lot of people come in and start to really think about cloud in a, that infamous D word, the disruptive nature of cloud to come in and change some really old habits and some really high cost points. So we've seen a lot of customers over the years take that first transition in. Can I start to move out of my tape inventories and my archiving services and things going off to a salt mine that I'll never be able to touch that data again? But I have regulatory compliance I need to be off and equate to. To now coming in and saying, well, if the cloud is this automated compute on demand environment, can I go in and start to really use it to the purposes that can really help me change the business. And back to one of the comments that Sabina made on things like DR as a service, this is a huge opportunity. We've been seeing a lot of customers that got their first taste of the cloud and the storage integrations back and forth, now coming back in to say, if you can help me really affect a DR recovery strategy in my business, I can start to really go in and change a lot of my operational cost structures. And I'll say it's not just an opportune time because the integration points are here, but actually we're starting to see inside market go back to a lot of the market events, ransomware, some of the other malware attacks. We've been dealing with a number of large enterprises that in the public domain came out with public stories where they lost 17,000 servers in under a minute in one of the most recent ransomware attacks. This is not just going in and locking your data away for Bitcoins. This is coming in and being a weapon of mass destruction. Another global shipping company lost 50,000 servers in the course of an hour. Their recovery for the business, they cited back at our user conference, was taking them almost 70 days to go back and recover, rebuild, and reestablish business to the same state it was the day before the operation happened. This is where many are coming back in to say, when I come back and look at a cloud environment, it's the elastic nature, it's the cloud on demand. Should I start to really invigorate and change my strategy to come back in and think about cloud in a whole new perspective? Not just a place to go off and play with some different workloads, but a place to really come back and rethink, how do I recover the business, keep myself in a ready state and say it's not 70 days till I get my business back into a normal state. Can I actually execute that in a couple of weeks? And I'll say from the enterprise teams inside there, a couple of weeks is what they're striving for. So this is not just the infamous, can I get it back in a 15-minute kind of a context inside here when you're dealing with 50,000 different endpoints. Back into the nature, it's coming back to that messaging and translating it back into those business cases. So it's coming back in with those cost-effective DR. This is where we're seeing some customers coming back in and trading off expensive solutions of the past where they were spending almost $1 million a year in DR offsiting cost. They were failing on a pretty regular basis inside there. The board came back and gave them one last chance. They came back in, we transformed them with the cloud-based services. They came back in, cut their cost structure dramatically, almost 80% less spending on the DR solution. And it's not just savings in their pocket. In many cases, what that becomes is a reinvestment going forward to say, now I can take some of that operational cost and reapply it to cloud-based, cloud-first type projects moving forward. So this is one of the key ones that we're seeing inside the investments. It's not always going back to the board to find new investment money to go forward. In many cases, you can go back in, find existing operations that can be improved dramatically, use that cost-effective savings to go back in and reinvest in some of the cloud-first projects going forward. So let me share a couple of quick customer examples, and I'll turn it on over to Dave over here. So one of the first ones, and this is kind of a follow-up to a presentation we did at reInvent last year, was our friends over at Dow Jones. So Dow Jones, or News Corp, is one of the leaders inside the space. They've taken a very aggressive cloud-first type strategy. In fact, their main objective inside there is to get 75% of their workloads running exclusively inside the AWS cloud on a go-forward basis. This is a project we started with them a number of years ago. It started, like I said before, that progression of how do I get my backups on site, protected first, start to move and transition some of those data sets into the cloud. As they start to reposition and move and migrate the workloads into the cloud, they just basically shift their protection plan to work inside the cloud on an exclusive basis. This is a case study we shared last year. In fact, Shaun, who is our CIO from Dow Jones, was up on stage with us, sharing his experiences inside there. What I'm happy to report now is what we've been doing is now working off of that data set in the cloud to say, how do we start to really unlock a lot of these new data DR recovery techniques back into that data set. Second one is another major project, and this is one that we've really done with a bunch of our partners. So as Sabina offered earlier on one of the slides with a bunch of the different customer names, one of the reInvent remessaging opportunities we've been doing is starting to build SI competency centers. So how do we come in and how do we help people understand the key learnings? This is not a space that we've all been through in 2 or 3 generations, so there's not a depth of best practice already available in market. A lot of this is learning on experience. So what we've done is we've worked with our AWS partner team to come back in and build some SI competency centers. We have a number of different vendors from HCL and AHEAD and the ProAct teams that come in and they participate in those competency centers to say, how do they come in and quickly start to implement complete solutions back to customers? Instead of having to go through months and months of learning on the job, can we come back in and really start to help them get faster time to value? Use some of the out-of-the-box solutions, use some of the new integration and best practices that it's not just a written document sitting up on a website. Many of those are pre-established templates, workflows, and other automation processes already delivered to come in and say, how do I turn on a service in a very fast nature? This is one of the use cases they've already implemented with a large-scale customer where they've already come in to migrate over a petabyte of data workloads out of the on-prem environments back into the clouds. And again, a lot of it is backed into some of those DR, dev tests, and other type use cases inside there. Many of these all start to intersect back and forth with the integration we talked about earlier, coming back in and wrapping it with that partnering experience. How do we help people get to the process and to the solution much faster? And a lot of it is still really based very much, as Sabina said earlier, coming back into that partnering relationship we have with the AWS teams. We're both in it to win it. This is a lot of our sit-downs, our quarterly meetings inside here to go through and say, how do we establish solutions? How do we start to promote these solutions out inside space? And really, how do we start to even learn from our own perspective a different working model? As somebody who grew up in the SAN and the data center environments, when we start to transform our own solution, our own infrastructure, we had to teach ourselves how to be much more elastic. What I mean by that is coming in to say, how do I have servers in my architecture that I start to power down when I don't need them? If you've come out of the data center environments, your worst fear ever was to go off and power servers off in the data center, because there's a high fear that they would never power back up again. The nice thing about the cloud is I can do it by command. When I don't need something, I can power it down to save operational costs back to the user. If I need to go in and bring 5 workers up to do more in a parallel nature, things like a DR type test, I can bring them up on demand, use them for the next 48 hours. When I'm done with the operations, go back in and destroy them and come back into that elastic nature. So that's why it's been a great transforming business for us to start to completely rethink not only how do we approach market, but how do we approach solutions together in this new landscape of the cloud. So with that, I'd like to say thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Brian. I'd like to introduce Dave Packer, VP of Product Marketing at Druva. Druva has built their SaaS solution completely using AWS Services, and in doing so, they have created differentiated value for customers. Thank you, Dave.
Great, thank you. Just make sure I know what we're doing here. There we go. Okay. So, it's interesting when you think about how cloud disrupts your business model. When we started our company in 2008, I don't even think at the time we even understood the implications. One of the big challenges that we were trying to address when we started our company was really the challenge we were seeing with organizations dealing with data spread and fragmentation. What I mean by that is data volume's growing, but they're moving to a lot of different places. The company's trying to be, your organization's trying to be more agile, so data's moving around more. And the sprawl combined with challenges of compliance, organization of that data, centralization, or having a single control plane for data protection and management quickly gets undermined over time as that data spreads and moves to a lot of different locations. And so, what we do is we provide a solution that enables organizations to federate all this data singularly on a totally global deduplicated data set on the cloud. And so to achieve that, though, it had to be native cloud. And we understood that from the get-go, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But at the heart of our system is a very efficient scale-out backup solution that allows you to go across all these various data sources, aggregate that data together, bring it together inside of the single golden data set. Now, the beauty of it for us has been that between what we can achieve with AWS is global reach, global visibility on side of this single data set that can span into the petabytes. Matter of fact, today we have a customer that's currently at 8 petabytes inside of our system inside the cloud. And I'll talk a little bit about the importance of why cloud native was the right decision in this process, because one of the elements that we've seen over time is that as the transformation over the last 9 years has happened for our company, a lot of the traditional on-premises systems that really have made the day for fast RTOs and access and backup recovery of data, kind of were a little bit late to the cloud model, and that's actually created a different set of challenges for businesses wanting to go to the cloud. Like, how do you do that efficiently? How do you make that migration happen? And in our world, we look at it as cloud first, and then extending that capability to the on-premises environment of these organizations. To get to the model we have today, though, we have over 4,000 customers. And as a company that was founded in 2008, we had to make a few big decisions early on. And one of them was, do we adopt the cloud? If we think back to 2008, cloud adoption was just getting a roll. It doesn't seem that long ago. But people were still making this statement, and they still make it today, that the cloud is really your data running in somebody else's data center, right? Which really isn't the truth. And one of the realizations we had early on was that the cloud offered actually a new form of operating system for business applications. And fundamentally, that's an important nuance, because part of our core competencies as a business is cloud. And we look at the cloud every day as an operating system, whether that's AWS or Microsoft Azure. How do you build the right application on top of these operating systems so that they deliver the right performance and cost efficiencies for your customers at the end of the day? Now, when we think about it from that standpoint, we had to think about, how do you manage this data? The traditional models are very much about silos and moving data and replicating data for different purposes, whether that be for e-discovery, compliance needs, for backup and recovery, for disaster recovery. The list goes on. And what we just thought was that if you could centralize this data model and bring it all together in a way that that data model could be managed, then you would be able to achieve kind of this ability to then work with that data in a different way. And I'll talk a little bit how we achieve that in a few moments. But what we saw was that if you were going to achieve this kind of massive pull of data, you had to do it a different way. Now, a lot of us, I'm sure, have been in businesses, I've been in data management and information management for years, where the goal of the company was to try to get that global view, or try to bring all that data together in a way that would offer that kind of manageability, but really not able to do that on premises. So our first big decision as a company was, is there a way that we can make cloud bring that to fruition? The second for us was, do we take what we were already building early on in our company life cycle as an on-premises model? Do we retrofit that and build it in the cloud? And the truth was we decided, for the benefit of foresight, that actually building it cloud native was the right way to go, and not to actually try to take what we were building for an on-premises solution and move that into the cloud. So we started from scratch. We basically erased everything and said, how do we do this and achieve this goal by not doing it the way that we were doing it before? And there's a simple reason for that, two of them. One is that you're trying to really achieve cost efficiency at the end of the day, right? For any of your business models, you're trying to give a customer something that they believe that the trade-offs from moving from where they are today to where they want to go aren't big trade-offs, but they get a lot of benefit and value out of it at the end of the day. And so we've always had this mantra that cost efficiency is number one. And so being able to achieve that was really clear for us. And the only way to do that, we believe, was by actually doing that within the cloud. And by developing technologies like auto-tiering, which allows us to move data to different storage tiers, whether it be S3, S3IA, or Glacier, based on the heuristics of that data, how often it's used, what are people doing with it. And by doing that, we continue to squeeze out more efficiency. So once the decision was made for us to go down the route of SaaS, the next question for us was, at that time in 2008, do we build it ourselves, right? Because if you think about it, in that time there was companies like Box and Salesforce, everybody was kind of building their own clouds. Do you do that yourself, or do you actually move kind of the plumbing of the operating system into somebody else's hands? And what we found out was that the trade-off for agility for us was to answer the simple question of what is our business at the end of the day. And our business is to provide data management services to customers. It's not to manage and build an operating system at the end of the day, right? And so that was kind of the aha moment for us. And it became obvious that really that the public cloud was already moving this direction, right? You had S3 at the time, you had EBS, you had some of the other services inside of AWS that we could utilize, and so we started going that direction. And we realized that it was a risk we were willing to take. Nobody in 2008 was really clear as to how fast the cloud would grow, how much people would embrace it. We were taking a big risk. If adoption was slow, our business would basically be flatlining for a long period of time and limit how much our company could grow at the end of the day. But one thing we did was we kind of went through a couple of elements to say, okay, what are some decisions we needed to make? One of them was whether we use block storage or use object storage, right? And for us, we went down the route originally because our original design of an on-premise system utilized block storage. But our CTO at the end of the day said, look, there's these other technologies that are coming online. What we believe is to get that cost efficiency, we could utilize S3, S3IA, and when the time came and Glacier was announced, it made sense for us to also start thinking about that and provide this architecture that was an auto-tiering architecture, right? Something we couldn't do on EBS. The other thing is that we wanted to provide a way for customers to easily scale into the petabytes, right? And block storage, at the end of the day, is fairly inefficient when you start growing to petabyte sizes, right? We hadn't planned at that point in time about petabyte sizes, but when one of our first very large customers, Pfizer, came to us and told us they had a few petabytes of data they wanted to store inside of AWS using our product, we were really happy we had made that decision at the end of the day, because that would have been very hard for us to manage. And really, ultimately, at the end of the day, even if we had tried it, it would have been very cost inefficient. The model would have changed and actually been much, much more expensive for customers to allow that and manage it within their systems. The second was the database. And this is an interesting one because we went back and forth with AWS on the database side for a while. We decided that because we were going the object storage route, that we were going to store all file metadata in a separate database. Right? So that would be all the attributes of all the files, all the tracking of files. Because we do global deduplication, everything's broken down into the block level. So we basically treat that data almost like it's being stored inside of a file system. Now, the advantage of that for us is we could put and pull data in near real time across any point in time. But one of the things is we had to have a real efficient way to manage the database. And we couldn't achieve that with a table-based database. Because at some point they max out, and then you have to either create a new database or you have to figure out a way to manage that differently. So the scale out becomes very difficult once you pass about 100 terabytes of data, right? And so what we found was that we wanted to use DynamoDB. And so Dynamo we started to adopt, but we found out from the standpoint of IOPS it became very expensive. And when we were trying to scale it, we found that the IOPS inside of Dynamo were becoming very expensive to us, which meant that we were going to have to raise prices to customers who were also already a little bit cloud sensitive. Back in that 2008 to 2010 period, there were a lot of companies that were heavy lifting their systems into the cloud. We have a lot of customers that felt kind of burned from their early cloud adoption and how expensive it became. So what we decided was to build our own database, our own NoSQL database. And we went down this project line, and we worked with AWS at the same time. But ultimately, very late in the process, we realized that through a lot of fine-tuning of our performance and a lot of other elements of it, that Sabina and the team were actually able to help us bring down the cost to something that was much more manageable, right? And that's something you always have to be very sensitive of, because at the end of the day, your customers are going to be impacted by those two things, right? IOPS and storage. That's really the bulk of the cost at the end of the day for you as a business. Those are your COGS. And so managing those has always been very important to us. And we are always, and Sabina knows this, we're always very steadfast at trying to figure out how are new ways we can squeeze out more efficiency. You know, things like adopting Lambda, for example. And using microservices is another way. We've been actually going that direction as well. Third was the key management system, right? And this is an important one for us because we have a lot of companies that are highly regulated. Matter of fact, our top 10 customers, 2 of them are basically Fortune 10 companies. The rest are medical device companies, pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer. They're companies that are government agencies or contractors to the U.S. government. And I'll talk a little bit about more of that in a second. But for them, security was really important. And so we had originally thought of a security model utilizing KMS or some type of key management system. And we looked at KMS. We decided at the end of the day, though, that rolling our own model for encryption was actually a better bet for us. Now, what I mean by that is what we utilized was something called envelope encryption, which allows us to actually store keys in a very secure manner inside of AWS in what's called a tokenized form. So it's basically the key itself is encrypted itself, and the proxy for those encryptions are the customer's credentials at the end of the day. And that's important for us because uniquely, we can't reset your password as a company. If you come to us and lose your admin passwords or if people lose we don't have any power to actually recover that. Admins can recover device passwords or end-user passwords within their organization, but we don't have any way to recover your admin password because of the way that the structure of the encryption is done. Now, that said, we do still use KMS. We just don't use it for the storage level encryption model. What we utilize it for is for credentials and for some other elements that are stored on the AWS side to manage that side. And over time, we've adopted other elements. We've adopted obviously S3IA and Glacier and CloudFront and the KMS itself. And we continue to expand on things like Lambda utilization because we feel that that's the best way to give optimized performance on the back end as well as minimize the cost to the customer. Now, that said, another key element that I mentioned earlier was around security. And security for us is like it is for AWS. It's job number one. We actually have a lot of sensitive customers that have a lot of sensitive data. Some of it's HIPAA regulated. So we have ourselves, Druva, as a set of audits. We cover SOC 2, we cover HIPAA. We also have FedRAMP now. So we just achieved our FedRAMP ATO about 30 days ago. Anybody looking at FedRAMP for their organizations, right? Okay. If you haven't started it, start it as soon as you can. It is a very long process. It took us 3 years to get through the FedRAMP process. And a lot of that was because the FedRAMP process changes over time a bit. Their controls and what their requirements change. So as you're looking at what development changes you need to make in your product to adapt to FedRAMP's requirements change. And that takes time. So, FIPS certified modules, the way that you store data, the way that your controls and how you're managing the cloud from an infrastructure standpoint, the way your business operates and how people have access to systems, right? So very important for FedRAMP. But I will say that we would have not have achieved it if we hadn't worked closely with the AWS team. There was a lot of things that you learn as you go down the FedRAMP cycle. Now, I, for whatever reason, was one of the people that started FedRAMP at my company at Druva, as year 3 rolled around, I felt somewhat regretful in some ways, but very happy we achieved it, just because of the amount of pain I put the company through over a 3-year period. It costs a lot of money to do it and make all these changes. It's a lot of commitments, but ultimately, at the end of the day, it's something that, we're one of 90 SaaS vendors, not even data protection, worldwide, that actually has a FedRAMP ATO on their product to run inside of GovCloud. That said, you have to, if you're going down the FedRAMP route, you have to be very cognizant that FedRAMP is sensitive to any changes or services that are being added to it. So it's not that you are FedRAMP and everything you have is now FedRAMP approved. As you change your product, or as AWS changes their product, you have to look at those services discreetly, and they also have to be approved on the FedRAMP cycle. Now, adding services after you've originally had your FedRAMP ATO is a lot easier. It's more of a few months than a few years. But it's important to understand, because when we got into it, KMS, for example, wasn't FedRAMP ATO yet. And when we got to that point, so now we just learned something that we didn't know, that we want to use KMS, but it's not FedRAMP ATO'd. So we went and we decided we were going to figure out our own failback. But again, working with AWS, we were actually able to determine the timelines and not have to go to our failback. They got ATO'd within a reasonable amount of time, and we were able to achieve that goal. So if you do go down that path, be prepared. It does take a lot of time, but it's well worth it in the end, especially when you think about a business. Barriers to entry are pretty critical at the end of the day. So for us, cloud isn't just a technology, it's a business model. It's an important mantra to our business. We look at it as a way to achieve better transparency of what we do to our customers. And what I mean by that is, for example, we have a system in place what we call consumption-based pricing. Now, this is something that when we first proposed it, our VCs kind of scratched their heads, because it was very hard for them to figure out how do they monetize that. And at the end of the day, from our standpoint, our CFO was a little confused, because we had to figure out how do we pay our sales team, right? Anybody have sales teams, right? Know what that's like? So consumption-based pricing, the model is basically like prepaid phone credits, right? You buy terabytes of data, and then you use those terabytes of data over time. If you don't use them, they roll over to the next month, right? If you go over that number, we basically send you a note and say, hey, you're over capacity, repay up on your credits. But from a customer standpoint, that's all they pay for. They only pay for that. There's no egress charges we charge for getting your data back. There's no IAPS charges. It's just purely a per terabyte storage charge that we put. And that was something that was a big change for us, because we had to figure out how to do that differently. And it's very disruptive too, because everybody's either stuck on classic perpetual licenses, or somehow you just pay up front some flat fee, or you pay as consumption grows. But what we have is actually a perfect capacity model. We wanted to mimic how the cloud does elasticity for compute and storage with the way that we did pricing. So, and for our real big customers, it's really important, because what happens? They acquire a company quickly. They want to bring that data in. They divest from a company. They want to break that data off and wall that data off now. They don't want it to be reflecting on their price bill anymore, so they don't have to. As soon as that data is no longer part of the service, the capacity drops, so does the pricing automatically for the customer. Some other things that we did were around cost optimizations. I mentioned that. Auto-tiered storage across S3, S3IA, and Glacier were critical for that. Along with that was the realization that, we were doing things that really required full multi-tenancy. To drive down costs, we started utilizing microservices. That's so we're not having to run an instance for every customer. We actually, in our system, run a complete stateless node architecture, and the microservices are utilized to actually even streamline that and bring performance even better. Now, you think about performance. We provide, for example, metadata search across our system. You can do a metadata search in sub 1 second across 5 petabytes of data. That's how quickly we can get responses back across large volumes of data. And we continue to actually increase that performance because we now have customers that are looking at the 10 plus petabyte range of storage within our system. Some other things, having a close relationship with our SA and that team are critical to our business. And that's really helped us keep that mindset of a cloud business. But I'll say there's one thing that's really interesting. Any of you work with MSPs in the audience? So here's an interesting one. You're 100% cloud native, all your storage is in the cloud, everything is, and you have people who want to be MSPs. Now, the model that's so much different is that your traditional MSP a lot of times has their own data centers, right? They have their own racks, they have their own colo, they want to store the data there, they've paid for it. We created a model for our MSPs where they could still achieve the same margins without having to have the data center, right? And at the end of the day, all that overhead that they once managed in their background, they didn't have to manage anymore, but they could still act as a service provider to their customers. And so we have multiple MSPs now across the globe that actually utilize it from that standpoint. Within our system, obviously, we've broken out ownership and the ability to manage multiple customers within that environment. But that was actually one kind of highlight moment for us where we kind of started realizing how we were doing something different. Because sometimes when you're in front of everybody else, you kind of have to educate people on why the world's changing and what that means. And that's actually sometimes a really hard spot to be in. I will speak from my own personal experience over the years that even with customers, you're going through a very heavy education cycle over and over again because the models that they are used to aren't the same models that you're running in the cloud. And because of that, there's always this, wait, let's back up a second and let's restart over, right? So what are some other things that we've learned as a company over the years? There's a lot of value inside of AWS, and I'm really happy to say that our bet that the cloud was going to be the new business operating system really paid off. As a matter of fact, AWS continues to show that, right, with the new services and offerings that they have. And we continually digging into that to figure out what can we use, how can we leverage this better. Things like Elasticsearch capabilities are key for us to figure out what people can do with this data. And it's not just about traditional data protection, right? It really is data management. How do we give organizations insight into petabytes of data so they can manage it through its life cycle like they used to be more accustomed to doing 10 or 15 years ago? That's an art that's been lost. And what we find is that a lot of our customers are just accumulating data without knowing what to do with it. And all that dark data that they've collected is costing them a lot of money. And they start putting that into the cloud, boy, it's going to cost them a lot more unless they do it more efficiently. And so our thing has been, how do we make people more efficient at understanding their data so that they can manage it through its life cycle, so they can get rid of what they don't need anymore and keep what they really have to stay aligned to all the various regulations and compliance needs of their business, right? So that was a key one. And that's why I say think differently, explore new business models. How do you do pricing differently? Can you leverage AWS Marketplace? A few years ago, we undertook a project of putting our product on AWS Marketplace. It's interesting because that's where we went into consumption pricing. We had to really think, how do we how do we model this different? So a customer that used to think, I have to go engage with somebody, I have to buy all this software, I have to buy all this infrastructure, how do I change that model so they can just click on a button, they can get the product, they can download it and run it, right? And that was where Marketplace has really kind of changed our thinking. Refine your messaging. Boy, as somebody who owns the messaging inside of Druva, this is one that you constantly have to work on because you are educating people at the end of the day. It's not just some fancy few words. It's about how do we really tell the story in a way that customers understand what they can achieve and how fundamentally different that is from what they were doing before. So I would say that's a big one. And you're going to reiterate it. I probably reiterated it now 100 times been at the company. And the second thing is, learn to adapt quickly. AWS moves fast. There's always new service and new capabilities. We're always looking at them and trying to understand them and figuring out how we can utilize them in our business. For example, I want to call it snowplow, but that's not it. Snowball. Snowball is, for us, is something that we're embracing very heavily, right? As our customers' data increases, we've got to figure out ways to both move data, what we call seeding data, quickly to the cloud, but also if they do have to stand up 200 terabytes quickly, how do we get that back to them in a really expedited fashion, right? And there's a lot of other ways to do that. We also, for example, Snowball Edge, we use to bridge to on-premises, right? Where data can just be using that as its target. And so those are other things that we're doing. But it makes it, at the end of the day, it's something that's really important to us, is making this as turnkey for our customers as possible. We don't want them to have to think about the plumbing and the infrastructure. When you go to use your water at the end of the day at your house, you don't think about the brass pipes. You don't think about how the water's coming in. You don't think about the speed dial or the meter outside, right? You just want to make sure there's hot water. And that's how we look at it from our standpoint. We want to deliver that hot water without having you to think about everything that underneath it. So constantly think about that, right? And you're going to learn to adapt and move over time. So let me move. I realize I'm running a little bit behind. 2 customer examples really quickly. Port of New Orleans. They're in the hurricane district of the world, right? Right on the Mississippi. They're very concerned about their infrastructure, and a lot of it has been on premises for years, and they wanted to figure out how to get out of that situation because their government mandate is that they protect that data, ensure that because they're a government-oriented agency, that data and information sustains over time. The other problem they had was no ability to really centralize policy management, right? So a lot of servers, a lot of locations, and they also had a lot of end users. And so what they did was they embraced our system to move their data to the cloud. And they are 100% cloud-based now. They have no infrastructure on premises anymore. At recovery, they can do very quickly using our caching system. But at the end of the day, what they achieved was the ability to select where regions they want their data stored in and ensure that their data is protected at any given point in time. So very important to them. And also, as an organization, they don't have to think about the hurricane problem anymore, right? I can tell a lot of stories around that because we have a lot of customers, for example, who are in Florida who had data centers north and south Florida and lost both. So there's another reason why cloud isolation and the ability to move your data where it can be protected is very key. The second is Live Nation, and I'll talk about this more just for a few seconds. Live Nation obviously is one of the largest entertainment services companies in the world. Highly distributed workforce, a lot of issues with lost data, employees losing laptops, taking with them information, and having it lost. What was great about this opportunity for us was this is one that AWS and us worked together very closely on. And I'll just stress this last point, which is that don't underestimate the value of the partnership with AWS. We do a lot of things with AWS, both on the marketing front and the customer front, as well as the technical front, that have had huge benefits to help us kind of get to the level we need to be at. And I would say that without that relationship, and without using that and getting the joint benefit from it, we wouldn't be where we are today. So thank you very much. I'll hand it back to you, Savita.
Thank you, Dave. Well, in closing, I just want to share 4 key takeaways. By talking to customers, we can understand the challenges they're facing as they execute their cloud-first strategy, and we can unlock incremental value for them. Business models are tough to adapt, I get it. However, if we work together in parallel to developing the solution, we can be aligned on pricing, channel, and messaging in front of the customer. We have tons of programs and resources to help you. And finally, I'm sure you concur, jump quick at go-to-market opportunities and keep the customer at the center when we are executing these activities. Thank you so much for attending this session. If you have any questions, we can take them offline. Thank you.